Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about in this category is the grid panel window. As we saw earlier with the one flow, when you put a button in, it would fill up the entire section it was putting the button into. Where if we put it into a panel first, the panel will then you can change the size of the button, or it comes in a default size, and then we put the panel in a section. So that's basically all this grid panel is doing. So if we look at it, again, we have our grid panel window and extends a J-frame, so it is a J-frame. We have our two constants for the window size. Then we go ahead and have our constructor. And so once instantiated, the constructor automatically executes. We set the title, we set the size, we set the default close operation. When you click on the X, what do you want to happen? Then we go ahead and say set the layout. So this is a method that's part of the J-frame set layout, and we instantiate it as a new grid layout with I believe that's 2 columns, 3 rows. And so we have button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, all the way through 6. So we go ahead and create 6 J button objects called button 1 through button 6. Instantiated it, and that's going to be the label of the button. We create 6 labels. We go ahead and say this is cell 1, so it goes ahead and puts a label in the label object, and then we go ahead and create 6 panels. Then I go ahead and say panel 1 through 6 dot add each one of those labels. So now each panel now has a label in it. It's going to say this is cell 1, cell 2, 3, all the 6. And then we go ahead and say panel 1 through 6 add a button. So we have to add the labels and buttons separately. And then we go ahead and say add each one of those panels to the J-frame. And then I go ahead and set that J-frame equal to true, and then now it displays on the screen. And there I have my public static void main, which goes ahead and runs this. And when I run it, well, obviously it must be 2 rows, 3 columns. Sorry, so when it says 2 comma 3, it's 2 rows, 3 columns. So it basically has the 6 buttons up there, and again, each button doesn't take up the entire section of that grid. So again, throw it into a panel, we can basically control the size of the button. If not, the button becomes monstrous. So if we go on to the next section, we get into radio buttons and checkboxes. So again, radio buttons are those kind of buttons that when you click on one and click on another, the previous one becomes unchecked. The same way with checkboxes, but I should say checkboxes are kind of like radio buttons, but with checkboxes I can check more than one, or I can check none. So I can check one or more or none. And well, it's probably easiest if we just look at the code. We have the metric converter. So if we look at the metric converter, there again, it extends the J, so it basically inherits everything the J frame has, and then we go ahead and create a bunch of objects. So it looks like these are basically instance variables. So we have a J panel, a J label, a text field, and 3 radio buttons, a button group, and then we have our window size constants. Here's our constructor. We set our title, we set our size, we set our default close operation, and we click build panel, which is a method down below here. Then we take that panel and add it to the J-frame, and then we make the J-frame visible. So we come down here to build panel. There we go ahead and instantiate the message label where it says enter the distance in kilometers. We instantiate the text field to 10. And then we have these 3 radio buttons, and they are instantiated as a J radio button, and one will say convert to miles. Notice it says comma true. That means that one will be automatically selected. If I left it off, none would be selected. And I have feet button instantiated as a new button, and the label is going to be convert to feet, convert to inches. Now with radio buttons, they're different, as though if I put just a bunch of radio buttons on a J-frame, I had, let's say, sex, male and female, and over here maybe I had age groups, 16 through 25, so on and so forth. Well, if they're all on the same plateau, if I selected sex as male and then I selected the age group as 16-25, the male would become unchecked because they're on the same level. So what we have to do with radio buttons is put them in their own group so that I can modify these radio buttons. It doesn't affect these over here. So that's what this is right here, a radio button group, and it's instantiated as a new button group. So we have button groups. And notice we didn't create an object out of it. We just said we're creating this radio group. So then I say radio button group dot add miles button dot add feet button dot add inches button. So we just have this group we've thrown the 3 buttons into. So now I can select those buttons and they won't affect any other radio buttons anywhere else because it's only going to affect those within the group. Then I go ahead and add an action listener to each one of the buttons, and it is using the same radio button listener. So in that listener, I'm going to have to determine which button was selected. We'll see that in a little bit. I instantiate a new J panel. And then that panel, I go ahead and add the message label, the text field, and then the 3 radio buttons. Okay. So here's that radio button listener. And again, it has to implement an interface. And then we've got our action performed, which is the default method. And we have our action event, which is a class. And we have our E, which is our object. So I've got string, which is called input, string convert to, and double result. And we basically initialize that to 0.0. So input, I need to get some input. Well, if I take the text field and .get text, it will take the text of that text box and throw it into the input variable. Then I can say, now this is where I can determine where each button is. I say if e.getSource is equal to the miles button, or feet button, or inches button, I'm going to do certain things. So I'm going to say convert to, which is a string, is going to say miles. If it's a feet, it's going to say feet. If it's inches, it's going to say inches. And then the result is equal to the input converted to a double times a numeric value for each one of those. So then at the end I just say input, which is the numeric value here, kilometers is, and then I give the result, and then they convert to. So if it was, let's say, miles, it would say, let's say I said 100 miles, it would say, or say 100 kilometers, I'd say 100 kilometers is, and then whatever the result was, miles. Okay? And then again, the public static void main is a method that executes this particular method, which instantiates a new metric converter. So notice it just will go ahead and grab this metric converter class and run it, because it doesn't have to instantiate anything because we're all in the same class. So it's an enter class. So I go ahead and run it, and it comes up. So enter distance to kilometers. I type in 100. I click convert to miles. It displays 62.13, blah, 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 blah. I can say to feet, and I can say to inches. Okay. So let's take a look at checkboxes now. And the checkbox is a lot like the radio buttons, except they can be both selected on the same time. So here's my color checkbox window, and again it extends to J-frame, so it basically has everything the J-frame has. We create some instance variables, which is a J-label, 2 checkboxes, and we have our 2 constants. And then we have our constructor, which is our color checkbox window. Again, we set the title, the size, the default operation when we click on the X. And then we got a message label, which we instantiate as a new message label when we say select the checkboxes to change the colors. So that's just an object sitting there with that text in it. Okay, we have to do something with it. And then I instantiate a yellow checkbox and a red checkbox. And we have yellow background and red foreground, and then we go ahead and have comma true for the red checkbox. That says it's going to go ahead and automatically have that box checked already. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then I have a listener. So I've got one listener for both checkboxes. That's a checkbox listener. So again, we're going to have to determine which button was, or which checkbox was checked. And then I say set layout. So this is part of the J-frame, and I instantiate it as a new flow layout. And there I add the message, the checkbox and checkbox to the J-frame, and then I go ahead and set the visibility equals true. So here's my listener. And again, I always have the item state changed, meaning when it changes, it automatically executes. And the e.getSource yellow checkbox, else it's a red checkbox, and there we can determine. Now, here's the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes. A checkbox, we need to check whether it's selected. If it's selected, it's got a check mark in it, else it doesn't have a check mark in it. So if it's selected, I go ahead and change the background color of the pane to yellow, and the checkbox I change to yellow, and the red checkbox I change to yellow. Else, I set all those three to light gray. If it's a red checkbox, I go ahead and say, if it's selected, change the foreground color, meaning just the font color, to red for each one of those, else change them all to black. Then here's my public static void main. It goes ahead and runs this class. So we run it, and here is our checkbox. I check it, turns everything to yellow. Uncheck it, turns everything to red. Now notice the red had a check mark in it. Well, since that was set to true, it automatically did it, but you know it didn't run anything. So what we have to do is we have in our constructor, we would have to check to see if that is selected, and we would have to then call the listener. So make sure when you use a default check that it is going to do what you think it's going to do. So here I can change it, turn the red off and on. I can change the yellow off and on, and basically go from there. Okay, so a lot of neat stuff there. I'm going to take that out real quick. Take that. So it did check the box, but it didn't do anything. So I believe that is all we're going to cover this week. 4 sections this week, 4 sections next week, and then we will get into the rest of chapter 4. So yeah. So yeah, next week we'll start with borders, and then we'll basically call it done. So again, if you have any questions, give me a yell, and we will, again, we can Skype or whatever it needs to be to get you the help you need. Okay? We'll see you next time.